Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. I am David Napsker, Executive Director for the Conference of Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers, and this is the first in our Leadership Summit webinar series. It will be focused on maritime transportation, and we're very pleased to have you joining us. This series is going to be focused on some of the most important issues facing our region, and our goal through all of this is to bring together some regional leaders that we can hear from, engage with you, and hopefully inspire us to work together in new ways to solve our region's problems and accelerate our work. As you saw before we started, we're very grateful to our many sponsors who have helped to make this series possible. We look forward to working with them and with all of you going forward. Our moderator, in terms of the format for today's program, our moderator will make some brief introductory remarks and then invite questions from our speakers. Following that, he will facilitate questions and answers. If you have questions at any time, please enter it into the question box on the GoToWebinar interface and indicate if it is directed to a particular individual or to the panel as a whole. Our moderator will then pose your questions as appropriate and as time allows. Today's presentation will be recorded, and a recording will be available on our website at www.gsgp.org. You'll also be able to find the slides that you'll be seeing today on the website. In terms of today's program, we'll be focused on maritime transportation, and this is the result of a number of collaborations among states and provinces, with industry partners, and with many others. One of our most important long-term partnerships is with the Port of Antwerp in Belgium, and we thank the port staff who are joining us today. Related to today's discussion, I'd like to make you aware of several documents that were recently posted to our website. These include the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Maritime 5-Year Action Plan, Green Marine's report on opportunities to improve environmental performance in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Maritime Transportation System. You'll be hearing more about that. Our Green Shipping Action Plan, and the Axia Institute's report on the challenges and opportunities of Great Lakes navigation. Again, you'll also be hearing more about that. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Director Jack Marchbanks of the Ohio Department of Transportation. Director Marchbanks leads the department and has been a partner of ours throughout his tenure. We look forward to hearing from him with some framing remarks, and then he will introduce our speakers, who we look forward to hearing from. Director, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And on behalf of Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor John Husted here in the state of Ohio, I'd like
Director, I think we need to have you turn your camera on.
Okay, I thought the camera was on. There we go. I am on now. All right, thank you.
All set, go ahead, Director.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor John Husted here in the great state of Ohio, thank you for joining us today. The first in a series of Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers Leadership Summit webinars. As you've heard, today's panel will focus on maritime transportation. And yes, it's true. Departments of transportation interact with more than just bridges and highways. We engage in all methods of transportation, including maritime. We understand the power and importance of the waterway system to the states, provinces, and global economy. I'm sure many of you are aware that the Great Lakes system is connected to the Atlantic Ocean to the east via the locks of the St. Lawrence Seaway operated by Canadian and U.S. Seaway corporations, and to Lake Superior to the west via locks of Sault Ste. Marie, the Soo locks operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Great Lakes connect us. Our economies and the health of our governments depend on our collective actions in caring for this great shared resource. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence Maritime Transportation System is one of our region's competitive advantages. With a network of more than 100 commercial ports generating more than $30 billion in annual revenues, maritime transportation is a backbone of the $6 trillion regional economy. 5 years ago, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers developed the first strategy to boost the efficiency and competitiveness of the regional maritime transportation system. In that time, our region has seen unprecedented progress, including secured authorization and full federal funding for a new Soo lock, launched Cruise the Great Lakes to promote the regional cruise industry, and developed a regional solution for passenger customs clearance. We built a transatlantic partnership with the Port of Antwerp in Belgium, a primary gateway port for our region to Western Europe. And we developed an innovative smart ships initiative that is helping to position our region at the forefront of cutting-edge technologies. Building on these successes, the governors and premiers developed a 5-year action plan meant to encourage smart and green maritime systems that will meet future demands. A green shipping action plan includes various actions intended to reduce emissions, increase efficiency, and set the stage for long-term progress. Building from research by Michigan State University's Axia Institute, we are working to develop smart technologies that will improve efficiency, safety, and environmental performance. The panel today will discuss ways to ensure this transportation system remains viable well into our future. Today's panel discussion will run for about an hour, and following their presentations, we'll be asking each panelist a series of questions around green shipping, smart shipping, and other strategies that may increase the economic value and environmental performance of the Great Lakes Maritime System. It is now my privilege to introduce Captain Drew Ferguson with the Davis Aerospace Maritime High School. Captain Ferguson, please give us some insights of the school's activities and recognize those students who have joined us today. Captain?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very excited to be here representing PHASTAR Corporation as well as the Davis Aerospace and Maritime High School. PHASTAR Corporation is a nonprofit based in Cleveland that was developed to break the cycle of poverty and increase equity in the workforce by providing hands-on experiential learning opportunities and work experiences for our kids in both the aerospace and maritime industries. We combine the experiential learning opportunities as well as the work experiences to engage our students in a meaningful learning environment, while also providing them connections to not only work and employment opportunities, but life experiences. The Davis Aerospace and Maritime High School is a Cleveland Metropolitan School District public high school. The Cleveland Metropolitan School District provides the staffing, the day-to-day operations, teachers, leadership, principals, general education, curriculum, and delivery. While PHASTAR, the primary exclusive partner of the Davis Aerospace and Maritime High School, provides the thematic curriculum support, professional development for the teachers and staff, and the experiential learning programs that connect the students to the industries. So our Davis Aerospace and Maritime High School students, through our specific maritime program, engage in our primary activities of education, environment, and safety. The educational aspect of PHASTAR maritime programming works with local universities, colleges, and other nonprofits to engage our students in on-water environmental programs, in youth boater education programs, and recreational programs such as boating and boat building. Environmental programs that we engage in are also water cleanup, river sweeps, watershed preservation, working with other partners like West Creek Conservancy, Cleveland Metro Parks and Port of Cleveland, and identifying and addressing the needs, utilizing PHASTAR vessels and students aboard to not only teach and learn the activities, but execute the plans to address any of those concerns that have been identified. Third aspect of our maritime programs, on-water programs, is safety. PHASTAR does operate a marine safety vessel, an EMS vessel that escorts commercial ships up and down the Cuyahoga River, providing for safe interaction of recreational and commercial vessels, while also providing emergency response. Students are able to also work aboard this vessel, gaining experience, not only maritime experience, but life experiences, giving back to their community, and building sea time. Students have also looked out in the community and identified needs within our maritime industry and developed their own specific programming to address those concerns. And a great example of that would be the life ring project that started at the Voinovich Park and will continue throughout the city's waterfront, where students designed and installed life ring and throw rope as well as signage stations throughout the city's park to help assist if someone falls in the water. So maritime education exploration, we have boating education that I had mentioned before, utilizing the Spirit of America program, which is an Ohio-based program that is offered around the country, as well as using the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Ohio Boater Education course. We do have boating mechanics programs, students that learn the technical aspects of the boats, engines, attending programs through the Lake Erie Marine Trades Association, such as Yamaha University. When it comes to water safety, we do get all of our students are required to get in the water. We teach them basic water safety, first aid, CPR training, and those students that want to advance, we introduce them to lifeguarding and certify them as lifeguards to not only improve their skills, but give them job opportunities on their way to a professional mariner career. Environmental education, again, mentioned Case Western Reserve University, as well as our river sweep and watershed restorations. Once students get those basic ground level courses, they are able to continue their exploration. We have boat building clubs, sailing programs, and rowing programs that exist within the community that aren't directly offered by PHASTAR, but are connected through our professional relationships. Again, I mentioned the 2543 is the vessel. It's a retired Coast Guard 25-foot RBS Defender. That is the primary vessel we use for our marine safety and large vessel escort program. And we already spoke about the North Coast Harbor project. None of this happens without key partnerships. Many businesses, government entities want to get involved in schools. And oftentimes we've found that when the partner goes directly to the school, oftentimes it becomes difficult and burdensome to not only establish the relationship, establish what the liabilities are, but to assure the long-term growth of that relationship and continue to grow it and expand it and recognize all the potential possibilities in that relationship. As PHASTAR serving as a primary partner, we are the gateway that allows many of these companies to come to us, let us work out the logistics so that they can provide meaningful direct programming to our students. An example of our key maritime partnerships in here in Cleveland would be the Port of Cleveland, Case Western Reserve University, University Hospitals, the Spirit of America program, Interlake Maritime Services, Interlake Steamship Company, the Lake Carriers Association, and Samsel Supply Company. So that gives you a brief overview. We may have students connecting in today. It's a little bit of a crazy day at the school, but I will do my best to answer any questions, and as I can find the students, I will try to get them to connect in here as well. Thank you.
Captain Ferguson, thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter is Mr. David Bolduc, the Executive Director with Green Marine, who will provide an overview about green shipping. David.
Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be with you today to share the highlights of this report that was released just a few days ago. So just before I start, a very quick word about Green Marine, which is an environmental certification program for the shipping industry in North America. About 60 ports, terminal operators, and ship owners are part of Green Marine in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region. So working on this report was really a natural fit for us, finding and encouraging best practices in the environment for the shipping industry. That's basically what we do all year long. Our mandate for this report was pretty broad, but basically we had two main tasks. So the first one was to survey existing best practices and technologies. We looked at what was being done here, of course, but also we looked at whether the best examples we could find elsewhere in North America, and also at 3 peer maritime systems in Europe. The second task was to propose specific recommendations for short-term actions and longer-term strategies. The three-tier European maritime system we looked at are the Baltic Sea, the Rhine River, and the Port of Antwerp. So these systems are very different from our waterways in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence, but they also have things in common. And I think we must admit that generally speaking, the Europeans are ahead of us when it comes to sustainable shipping. And it makes sense to look at what they do for installation. The study looks at ways to improve the environmental performance of our maritime transportation system. This is, however, a very broad concept, and really we had to focus on a limited number of environmental issues, which you can see the list here on this slide. We do focus more on greenhouse gases emissions in the report, more than anything else, as this is certainly the most urgent environmental challenge that we're all facing. The survey we conducted shows that the maritime industry in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region is already implementing many best management practices and new technologies to improve its environmental performance. Some of them may not be very widespread yet, but we have several leaders in the system trying out new things. So just to give you a few examples that are mentioned in the report, on the vessel side, several ship owners have started very ambitious projects and innovative projects, like buying LNG-powered vessel, testing biofuel on a large scale, certifying zero-waste ships, installing scrubbers, and so on and so on. On the land side, some of the most innovative practices include shore power, electric unloading equipment, predictive data analysis to improve the flow of truck traffic in ports. We even have the Port of Milwaukee. We have a picture there of their wind tower that is powering their office building. So this is just a very, very small sample of all the great things that are being done. And among all those examples, we tried to identify quick wins to improve the environmental performance of the entire system. And this is where we're getting to the recommendations. So in the report, we have about 50 recommendations that are summarized at the very end in different tables. So this is, of course, not digestible for a presentation like this, but I'll just focus on our top 10 short-term actions. Since climate change is the #1 environmental issue that we hear about every day in the news, it's not surprising that 4 of our top 10 actions are related to that. So the most important short-term goal in that regard is to monitor your emissions and reduce them by improving the energy efficiency of your operations. Ports should assess the benefits of shore power, and we also recommend that they assess the impacts of climate change on maritime infrastructure. Ship owners should carry out energy efficiency audits to identify the best opportunities for improvement, and digitalization can play a very important role in that regard. So this is a figure from a study carried out by a researcher from the Baltic Sea region, and this graph shows the potential positive impacts of various components to reduce emissions to 0 by 2050. So they estimate that improved efficiencies in voyage optimization and cargo coordination, mainly thanks to digitalization, could represent up to 40% of all GHG reductions. Many shipping companies and ports have already started using all types of software to monitor and optimize different aspects of their operations, but really there's still a lot of opportunities there. Regarding water quality, there's usually very strict regulations in place to prevent water contamination. So the actions recommended here really aim at minimizing the risk of water contamination to the greatest possible extent. Ship owners should invest in the best available equipment to monitor and treat oily water. When possible, they should even adopt a zero discharge policy. For landside facilities, protecting water quality is all about pollution prevention and stormwater management. Some of the best practices that should be implemented include training employees on the use of spill kits and monitoring stormwater quality. And in the longer term, ideally, all port areas where there's stormwater contamination risk should be designed so that no untreated stormwater reaches sewers or surface waters. On the topic of biodiversity, we're looking at marine mammals and biofouling. In the short term, the best way to avoid ship strikes with marine mammals is to adhere to existing voluntary measures that are put in place by governments. And we're talking here about slowdowns and rerouting. As for biofouling, which can be a potential vector of aquatic invasive species, ship owners have different options depending on the level of risk their trade route represents. So different types of specialized coatings or biofouling resistant paints are available on the market. But in any case, the first step is always a good hull cleaning as frequently as possible. Waste management is a common issue to all industries. So the first thing to do to reduce one's footprint is actually the same everywhere. You need a cultural shift within the organization to reduce waste at the source and integrate the 3RV principles: reduce, reuse, recycle, and valorize. Our last recommendation here has to do with community relations in ports. If citizens are complaining about noise or dust coming from the port, the first thing to do is to acknowledge the problem. Then you start to measure the problem so you can act quickly where needed. What we've seen at several ports that are facing issues with air quality and noise is that they install permanent monitoring equipment. So all the recommendations so far that I've mentioned target the industry. However, governments also have a very important role to play to encourage and accelerate environmental improvement. So here are 4 high-level recommendations for them. Governments should encourage research, development, and demonstration projects by supporting the technology and innovation ecosystem. For example, we're talking here about business clusters, incubators, and accelerators. They should be supported in their mission, and new ones should be created. The second high-level and long-term strategy is to prepare for the energy transition away from fossil fuels. So this is really not an easy one. We don't know yet which alternative fuel will be the winner for the shipping industry. Hydrogen, ammonia, biofuels, and electric batteries are among the most promising options, depending on the type of vessel or equipment that we're talking about. In all cases, there will be policy and regulatory obstacles to replace the existing oil supply chain by the new supply chains for the new type of alternative fuels. So the discussion on this complicated topic should start as soon as possible. Another strategy that is being increasingly used to encourage green shipping is to incentivize it. For example, by supporting differentiated fee structures for greener ships. There are several examples of that in Europe and on the West Coast. We also need more government programs that support financially the installation of greener technologies. And finally, I couldn't not mention the harmonization of US and Canadian approaches. The Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River are a single maritime transportation system, and it's also a single ecosystem. So the rules should be the same on both sides of the border as much as possible. We provide a few examples in the report where harmonization would be most desirable, but this should really be a constant objective for all environmental issues. So that concludes my speed run through this report with the highlights. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be happy to answer questions afterward.
Thank you, Director Bolduc. Our final speaker for this webinar today is Dr. David Close, Professor Emeritus with the Michigan State University Axia Institute, who will present an overview on smart shipping, something we are all interested in. Dr. Close.
Thank you, Jack, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk to you about this. I just want to check, can people hear me and not get feedback? Is that okay?
Yes, we can hear you well, David.
Okay, great, thank you. On behalf of the Axia Institute and Michigan State University, we're very happy to share our findings with you and talk about challenges and opportunities for the Great Lakes. Just a little bit of background, Michigan State is, for this week, has been identified as the top, for the 17th year, been identified as the top supply chain program in the country. And so we're very proud of that. We're very proud of it to share it with our Michigan region and provide some insight regarding the opportunities for the Great Lakes. The grand challenge for this project was looking at the potential benefits of a data sharing platform and value-based tools to realize supply chain efficiencies for specifically the taconite and steel industry. So we're looking at the iron ore industry and saying, what are the opportunities to reduce fuel utilization, and what are the opportunities to reduce generation of greenhouse gases? And a related one is, what are the opportunities for the use of digital technology for the industry? The approach to this, we looked at the movement of iron ore on the Great Lakes in the last 5 years. And we wanted to understand what the time delays or the impact of time delays due to congestion were. And so we used some work provided by Dennis Segru, and when he studied the movements on the Great Lakes over the last 20 years. You notice in the left-hand side graphic, you will see a little bubble where there's a bump, and this is movement through the St. Lawrence River. On the right-hand side, you don't see the bump. So based on discussions with Dennis and some of his analysis, we took the assumption that the bumps on the right-hand side, the long part of the curve, were due to congestion and delays, and if we could help or take away some of those delays, we could save that much fuel and that much time in terms of the ship. So that's the overall methodology we did to look at the movement in terms of supply chain moves. So a specific example of that is this is a normal distribution. The average time for ship movement on the lakes, again, we're focusing entirely on taconite shipments, is about 78 hours from port, from origin to destination, and that includes the loading time at the origin. And then the standard deviation around that, it ranges, depending on the lane, ranges about 10 hours to about 29 hours. So we see a pretty high variation of that. Well, we targeted the green area on the right-hand side and labeled those as delayed. And those are the ones with more than 1 hour standard deviation and less than 2 hours. So that's about 15. It should be about 15% of the cruises. It was actually a little bit less than that. The second question we had was consideration of the next port application from the Port of Antwerp, and see what that could do to assist in tracking and scheduling of iron ore vessels on the 4 upper Great Lakes. Due to the relatively few number of carriers at this point, there are three. There was a combination over the last year. So there's only 3 carriers, and there's a substantial concern regarding the confidentiality and the need for sharing. In their mind, and I'll talk a bit more about this, this is not a terribly complex supply chain because you're dealing with vessels that move pretty continuously between the same ports and the same destinations. And there was a lot of reluctance to share information, to even set up a situation where the information might be shared. So since each lane was primarily controlled by a single mine, carrier, mill combination, there's not a lot of significant, not a lot of need to share information. Most of the tracking and analysis today is done with spreadsheets and phone calls and faxes and emails. So very different than in Antwerp, where you have a lot more shippers, a lot more customers, and obviously also a lot more carriers. So results review, we looked at it from, the analysis included 3 parts. The stakeholder interviews, where we interviewed 8 of the people involved, 8 of the firms involved in the industry, in the iron ore industry on the Great Lakes, and some government organizations and NGOs. We also analyzed quantitative data, as I mentioned earlier, based on 5 years from 2016 to 2020 worth of taconite shipments. And then we also analyzed or evaluated the NextCom system and a Nexport system, and said, will this really provide value to the iron ore industry on the Great Lakes? And the next 3 slides will cover our conclusions based on that. So from the stakeholder interviews, in total 8 organizations and 15 individuals were interviewed, while the industry and governmental organizations indicated that they thought the information platform provided would be helpful. The mines, mills, and carriers did not express strong support. They said it might be useful, but again, there's probably a stronger concern about loss of competitiveness than there was in terms of use of the tracking capabilities. So there doesn't seem to be a strong need for the industry to have a more sophisticated tracking system. Now, just as a point, the taconite industry is 65% of the tons on the lakes, on the upper 4 Great Lakes, and 31% of the shipments. So it's the elephant, if you will, in terms of movements. And we're moving in 1,000-foot vessels and pretty continuously from March or middle of March through middle of January. And there's a little bit uniqueness about the shipments here is they're not, it's not like somebody places an order for taconite. It's that the mills generate, the mines generate volume of taconite. They put it at the dock, the ship comes in and loads it up, loads up 70 or 80,000 tons of taconite and leaves. And they just continuously do that. So there's not something like where you place an order and want it delivered at a certain time. It's sort of a continuous process. The quantitative analysis, as I mentioned earlier, went from 2016 to 2020. It's 65% of the tonnage, 31% of the sailings. And the sources of this are the mines in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The destinations or mills are Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, and yeah, that's the main ones. The average time, as I noted, were about 78 hours, and that's including the loading time at the dock. The research defined the late shipments as those that were in that second standard deviation above the mean, and the financial considerations comes out of a research study by CPCS, which was just put out. Averages indicated that the variable cost per hour, variable costs including the labor and the fuel cost, the variable cost per hour was about $1,200. So we were saying if we could cut 1 hour out of the average, for every hour you cut out, it's $1,200 in variable cost. Did not consider the fixed cost of vessels or the depreciation of the vessels. When the sample shipments were projected to the total number of annual shipments, we found that we could save about $1.4 million on a base of $63 million. So that's about 2.21%, which is $1 million is significant, but it's not a very high percentage. So we'll get back to that in a minute. The next port analysis, we analyzed and interviewed the next port teams in Antwerp, and then studied the capabilities of the systems that they have developed and the decision support capabilities they developed. We found that they had a strong and flexible foundation for database to make products and ships and facilities as items move through the supply chain. So very strong capabilities there. They're generally developed using supply chain collaborations, industry organizations, and third-party developers. And they're almost exclusively developed either to use for containers or bulk product. And when I say bulk product in this context, I mean like rolls of steel or iron beams or something like that, not bulk in the sense of taconite pellets. And that's very, very different in terms of moving product. Taconite pellets, they just dump them into the ship and fill them up, as I said, with 60 or 70,000 tons of it, and they scoop it out or take it out via conveyors. The situation with containers is they're lifted out, or even rolls of steel is they're lifted out with cranes. It would be necessary for the industry or others to develop specific applications for if we were going to use it for taconite, which would be probably fairly difficult in a concentrated industry where they generally don't want to share their best practices. So in summary, while the export platform and decision applications could be immediately useful to facilitate, for example, Great Lakes container operations, the value for taconite is not going to be substantial. So our conclusions were to not focus on the taconite, but explore the potential for use of Nexport and related decision applications for other cargoes, like bulk cargoes in the sense of steel and iron ore and things that have some level of aggregation, break bulk containers, roll on and roll off in the upper Great Lakes. Roll on and roll off would be an example of the auto industry moving finished product or raw material, but primarily finished autos around the major Great Lakes markets. And I know that's been some consideration. We could also explore the application export platform and decision applications in areas of high congestion, which would be the Sioux Locks and the St. Mary River. There is congestion at the mines and the mills, but that's primarily under control of the steel companies, and they do a reasonably good job of handling that congestion, and they're probably not going to use be able to use something to export in a fairly restricted area. The advantage of the Sioux Locks and the St. Mary's River is it has multiple vessels and multiple different kinds of vessels, and there may be an application. So the delay reduction could result in the savings, as I mentioned earlier, of about 2 to 2.5% in variable cost, and in terms of greenhouse gases, it could reduce greenhouse gas generation by about 1.4 million, or about 2% as well, a little bit over 2%. So we could consider the use of Nexport platform and decision applications that are most developed and ready to implement for the region to promote the use of container trade and other types of roll-on or unit type of trade on the Great Lakes. So our next steps, our next suggestions would be, if you wanted to proceed further, is evaluate the opportunity for evaluating data sharing to reduce transit times and reduce costs and greenhouse gas emissions at the locks and maybe at specific docks, but that was not as obvious. Evaluate the opportunity for improved data sharing to improve value for other bulk cargoes already moving on the lakes, where break bulk and containers may have some opportunities there. Evaluate the potential for increased container trade on the Great Lakes, either between facilities on the Great Lakes and between ports on the Great Lakes, or like Cleveland is doing with international ports. Now, the interesting thing about international ports, and it's somewhat unique, that most container trade is on very, very large ships having 15 to 20,000 container equivalent units, 20-foot equivalent units of containers, which are very large and don't fit through the St. Lawrence Seaway. So you need to do some either moving product from one ship to the other, or using railroads as a way to do it. There are some other things to explore there. Evaluate the potential for improved data sharing for greenhouse gases, and evaluate the value proposition of moving specialized freight such as automobiles. The movement of freight on the Great Lakes is not the same as on the ocean, obviously, and so you got to be a little bit creative in applying it. And the objective is to see how the application of these principles can work to enhance the value of the industry. So with that in mind, thank you again for the opportunity to look into this, and turn it back to you, Jack.
Thank you, Dr. Claus, and thanks to Captain Ferguson and Director Bolduc. We invite questions now from our audience. Please ask your questions by typing them into the question box on our webinar interface, and identify if they are directed to a particular speaker. I will then pose the questions verbally to our speakers. But because I don't have my reading glasses with me, I may ask David Nafsinger to assist me with posing questions put forward by the audience. But I'm going to exercise a little bit of moderator prerogative. And I'd like to ask a question first from David Bolduc of Green Marine. Can you describe the different drivers, whether regulatory or voluntary, for ship owners and other industry actors to reduce their emissions from ocean-going vessels to U.S. tankers? Director Bolduc?
Yeah, my mic is on. The regulatory driver is really important, of course. And the shipping industry is an international industry, so we're looking a lot at what is happening at the international level. So I'm thinking of a recent discussion at the International Maritime Organizations, where very ambitious reduction targets in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions have been set. So there's still a long way before we see in the national regulation the impact of that international regulation, but the direction is clearly there. So there's a goal to reduce the greenhouse gases of the international shipping by 40% by 2030 and by 50% for 2050. So that's significant. And clearly will soon, this is something that national governments will need to implement and will need to adapt actually for the reality of the domestic shipping. So yeah, this is a very significant direction that is coming, an obvious international trend that has an impact on everybody.
All right, thank you, Director Bolduc. A question for Dr. Klaas. What are the opportunities for data sharing to drive efficiency improvements in our regional maritime system? You mentioned proprietary information and the fact that it's hard to get some of the major players to share information. What can we do to make this more possible? Dr. Klaas?
Yes, thanks, Jim. The major opportunities for data sharing are to consolidate loads so we can put products from multiple customers or multiple suppliers into one load or one container. That's a huge opportunity today because with increasing transportation costs, which we're seeing around the world, it is a significant problem if you're not using all the space in a container. So information and data sharing facilitates that. The other opportunity is to better schedule ships and containers as they move through over the lakes or into harbors, because right now generally the ships will cruise at their sort of standard rate of 13 knots an hour, and the first one that gets to the port gets access to the dock. Well, if somebody knows they're not going to be first in line at the dock, it doesn't make sense for them to cruise at 13 knots an hour. It makes more sense for them to slow down and save fuel and save greenhouse gases. So knowledge of time in transit, where you are relative to other ships, is important there. So that's another opportunity. And the third one would be sort of the understanding of probably not so much routing, although that is an issue of how to route shipments, but it would be to which products should be on which ships and what are the opportunities for some types of consolidation. So those would be the primary ones if we looked at the Great Lakes. I guess another one to talk about would be opportunities to use the lake as an alternative to railroad. And I have to put my lake hat on and say there are certainly many congested areas on the railroads and shortage of availability of capacity. And if we can use the lakes as an alternative water highway to move instead of trying to route product through Chicago, the Chicago rail system is extremely congested. If we can use the lakes to move some items around that would be an improvement too. And in order to get to that, we have to understand the relative cost.
Thank you for that. And since I'm standing here as a member of Governor DeWine's administration, and we have launched in Ohio, H2 Ohio, specifically focused on environmental improvements on our lake, Lake Erie. This is for anyone who wants to answer among our presenters today. What can the states and provinces do to provide leadership and encourage change that will, advance the things we've spoken of today, smart shipping and better environmental stewardship of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway?
Maybe I can say a few words about this. because during our report, we had to look at the different programs out there, and most of them are at the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to mention that the government of Quebec had a very specific program targeting greenhouse gas reductions for the shipping industry. So over the last 7 years, they invested about $40 million in that, and it really had an impact. I know of several projects that wouldn't have seen the day without that help from the government. So that's possible even at the state and provincial level. And just having a comprehensive maritime strategy also sends a very strong message to the industry about, about the future direction of environmental performance of our shipping industry.
Very good. Thank you, Director Bolduc. David Nasker, are questions from those who are listening in and on the webinar? Do you have any questions for that?
Yes, Director. Our first question is for David Bolduc. The question is, what does green infrastructure look like on a ship or more generally within the maritime system?
Well, green infrastructure, usually it's a term that is used on the land side, not necessarily for ships. So on the topic of water quality and stormwater management, green infrastructure means to use nature to help you better manage storm water. So it can be trees, the different types of soils that helps a good drainage of the environment. So that's one way, and I'm thinking I have in mind a project at the Port of Seattle where they use mussels or oysters to help treat stormwater. So that's very, very impressive. Otherwise, green infrastructure, I think, can also refer to any infrastructure that is built with resiliency in mind for the future, to be able to address the issue with climate change. Infrastructure that will use materials also that don't create other environmental problems, or that they have a life cycle that is greener than the previous generation of material. So it's a broad term that can mean many things.
All right, David, we have more time for some questions from our webinar participants. Questions?
Our next question is again for David Bolduc. You spoke during your presentation about some things that ports could do. Could you talk more specifically about what ports could do to reduce air emissions from operations in or around the port?
Well, as I said, the first step, you need a baseline. You need to know exactly how much you emit, your emissions. So you do an inventory. That's the first step. And then you try to find areas where you can reduce. So energy audits. So that's something that should be done by every type of organization, actually. But other than that, at a port, a lot of emissions come from the operations, from the terminals, actually. So electrification is key there. And we've seen, especially in Montreal, I'm thinking of examples there, some of the first terminals almost in the world that are entirely managed with electric equipment, cargo handling equipment. So electrification is key. This being said, again, the life cycle approach is important here. If the electricity comes coal power plant, maybe the net benefit in the end is not as good as you'd like. So this is something that you need to keep in mind.
Very good.
Thank
you, Director. David, we have time for about one more question.
All right, thank you, Director. Our final question will be for Captain Ferguson. Could you describe some examples of career paths that your students may take after they complete their studies at the high school. Captain, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
That seems to be a better connection.
Go ahead, please.
All right, I apologize.
All right, Director, it appears we were having a technical issue with Captain Ferguson, so I encourage you to make some brief concluding remarks, and then I'll be happy to wrap up in the end.
Well, thank you, David. Appreciate everyone who was involved today. As we close in on the hour, I would like to thank all the panelists for their time and expertise. We'd like to thank the Davis Aerospace and Maritime High School students who joined us today, and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence governors and premiers for hosting this series of leadership summits. I hope everyone who participated today has a better understanding of a few important issues surrounding the Great Lakes in a much better way. Dave or Mike, would you like to talk about the 4 other upcoming seminars?
I would. Thank you very much, Director Marchbanks, for being our moderator today, and thanks to the panelists and all of you for joining us today. If you've not already, we'd encourage you to register and join us for our upcoming webinars. You can find registration information on our website at www.gsgp.org. And our next one will be focused on water infrastructure. We have a terrific set of speakers and the moderator. It will be September 29th at 11 o'clock Eastern. Following that, we have a session on impact investment, invasive species, and the economic development opportunity of carbon. So hope you can join us. We would like to again thank our sponsors for their generous support of this series, and to all the partners for your continued work with us. As noted previously, a recording of today's webinar will be posted to our website, including all the slides that you saw today. Please share them with whomever may be interested, and we look forward to our future opportunities to talk with all of you. So thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to our next webinar next week. Goodbye.